in looking at this particular executive order, what it does is the following. It basically makes 5 separate lists, okay? So it requires that the Department of Corrections create a list of inmates, number 1, who are 60 years of older and have a underlying medical condition that would increase their risk of death or serious bodily injury from COVID-19. That's number 1. Number 2 creates a list of remaining inmates who are either 60 years of age or older or possess this underlying medical condition that might increase their risk of death or serious injury from COVID-19. The third list is inmates who were denied parole in the last year and who, aren't on list number 1 or list number 2. The fourth list are those inmates who are serving a prison sentence and have a release date within the next 3 months, within the next 90 days. And then finally, there's a fifth list that is anybody else who might fall into one of those previous 4 categories. And the DOC, the Department of Corrections in New Jersey, has to basically at least once a week take another look to see if there's anybody else who might fall within category 1 through 4. And so this executive order prioritizes based on 1, 2, 3, or 4, whatever list an inmate may fall into. Okay. So,
real quick, Meg, I got confused. Number 1 and number 2 sounded exactly the same. Can you review number 1 and number 2 again? Because I have them both as 60 years plus or underlying conditions.
No, number 1 is end.
Okay, so first is 60 years plus underlying conditions. Number 2 is 60 years or they have underlying conditions, one of the two. Number 3 is they were denied parole in the last year. So they go back and review those people, whether they're 60 or whether they have underlying conditions is irrelevant, correct?
Right. And yeah, the third list would be denied parole within the last year, and they aren't on list 1 or 2. The fourth list is basically they are going to be paroled or max out within the next 90 days. And the fifth list is a list that the DOC is required to generate at least once a week, in which they are, going over these lists again. Anybody else who might, for whatever reason, face a heightened risk of death or serious injury from COVID-19.
They need to review that weekly. So somebody who this week doesn't fall into any of those categories, any of the first 4 categories. Next week, I want to take a look again because, for example, next week, a handful of people might fall into the category of their release dates in the next 90 days. So maybe we want to review them as quick as possible, and they're good candidates to get out, some of them. Exactly. Okay.
Right. So the fifth category is essentially just requiring the Department of Corrections, the DOC, to take a look at
7-day roll.
Correct. Every week, it says a periodic basis of at least once a week, to make sure, again, that there are no inmates that might, a week in fall within categories 1 through 4. And those first 4 lists are prioritized, 1 being the most, the biggest priority, 2, 3, and 4.
You shouldn't be allowed to let it go more than a week because somebody's going to turn from 59 to 60 this week. Somebody's going to get an underlying condition this week. And those are the things, if they get an underlying condition, you don't want to make a move on it in 3 weeks because, people would, that's how long it's taking for people to drop dead,
Exactly.
There's no point at that point. So refreshing it at least once a week makes a lot of sense for people who then become high risk, can get flushed out kind of the system before it becomes, because having a lot of people die is going to be a bigger problem.
This is consistent with what other state governors are doing, to combat the issues that these prisons are facing. The prisons, again, are facing issues separate and apart from the issues that the jails are facing. So once these lists are created, the Department of Corrections then has to give the list over to the prosecutor's offices and the Division of Criminal Justice, so they can look at the list. The prosecutor's offices have 5 days to basically notify the victim and submit, their view with regard to each of these individuals on these lists. Okay, so the Department of Correction then has to give the list to the state parole board, and the state parole board has to then give expedited consideration, using telephonic hearings if need be, to consider whether or not any of these individuals, are eligible for parole. Okay.
I don't want to sound pessimistic, but what are the chances? 5 days. When you got to the point where you're like, a prosecutor has 5 days, or any?
I'm sure the prosecutor's offices aren't happy about that, right? But I think in many of the counties in New Jersey, the prosecutor's offices will be, busy. And again, the point of this, though, is that it is giving prosecutors' offices the ability to give input on specific inmates and on specific release, the release of specific inmates. So, that's important. Again, as we go through this order, I think it will be clear that there was a real effort to balance, not only the, public health issues, the public safety issues, and victims' rights. And I know Governor Murphy in his announcement commented on that this order really tries to achieve that particular balance. So basically the lists get sent to the prosecutor's offices and Division of Criminal Justice. The list also gets sent to the parole board, who at that point in time has to go through, again, prioritizing the individuals on list number 1, then list number 2, then list number 3, then list number 4, to determine whether or not any of those inmates, could be paroled. Again, regardless of whether or not they were recently denied. So it's got to consider inmates for parole, again, regardless of whether the state parole board had previously denied them as being eligible and gave them a future parole eligibility date. So that's the first part of this order, is reviewing these lists to determine if any of those inmates, again, in order of priority, could be eligible for parole. The second part of this order establishes an emergency medical review committee. And on this committee will be a designee from Department of Corrections, commissioner, and a designee, from the parole board. And what happens on that is that inmates are going to be considered for emergency medical temporary home confinement. And so, again, this medical review committee has to prepare a recommendation on each inmate on each of the lists to determine whether the commissioner of the Department of Corrections should authorize a period of emergency medical temporary home confinement. And, the order acknowledges in the beginning that, there are circumstances where the DOC can authorize temporary furloughs of inmates for particular reasons. So, this idea that you are going to temporarily release inmates into the community is not something that's completely novel. There is in our laws in New Jersey already in place a provision for temporary furloughs, and that, again, the order acknowledges
the movies.
Right, a temporary for. I mean, for example, if there's a death in the family, sometimes inmates are furloughed. You know, and again, it's on a case-by-case basis. So again, the second part of this order is this medical review committee that's going to consider temporary release. You know, but it's important to note that the recommendation that this committee comes up with, you know, is going to include and requires in this order to look at a couple things. They're required to describe the views of the prosecutor, if any. It requires them to consider whether or not there is going to be a community sponsor for that particular inmate, a supervision plan, conditions, if released, on the scope of their restrictions of travel, you know, whether or not there are going to be appropriate medical and social services, whether there's going to be appropriate housing, whether that inmate has, and, you know, verifying that, you know, the conditions that this inmate is going to be released on, you know, verifying that their release would ultimately present a lower risk of them contracting COVID-19 than they would face if they were to remain in a DOC, Department of Corrections facility. So that's the, you know, the whole reason to release these particular individuals is to, you know, assure that it would present a lower risk to that inmate if released. Again, assuming that these conditions were in place. They had a place to go, they had a sponsor, they had services to them, available to them. So the next thing that happens is the following. Within 3 days of receiving a recommendation from this committee, the commissioner of the Department of Corrections has to then decide whether or not temporary home confinement is going to be appropriate for a particular inmate. You know, and again, the commissioner has to be satisfied. The commissioner, per this order, is not authorized to, you know, allow an inmate to be released on temporary home confinement unless that the commissioner is satisfied, you know, that the proposed conditions are going to be such that they appropriately safeguard the health and safety of the inmate, the health and safety of the general public, and any victims of the inmate's offense. So
it's a lot of rules.
A lot of rules.
Are you reading this? Do you have this in front of you?
I'm going through it. Yeah, I mean,
I was going to say, if you could, because every time you want to go section with some details, I'm like, wow, you really did read a lot. So the first,
well, I think it's important. It's important, obviously, to know all the pieces that are in place. It's not just that. It's not that the governor's just ordering inmates to be released. I mean, there's a lot of steps, and there are a lot of people involved, as it should be, I would imagine. I mean, I think that makes sense. Again, we're talking about a balancing.
It seems like, and that's actually, so I thought that was the headline, but that's really not the headline. That's like a bullet point under the two process system that they're employing. The first one being the conditions review that has to happen at least weekly. And then the second part being the emergency medical sort of review committee, the home confinement. So the headline is really that there's sort of a two-step initiative to try and head this off in the pass. All the details or criteria of conditions and parole conditions, those are all sort of underlying what is either going to be a review of a list that gets updated every week, and you either fall into these conditions and then get processed. Now, is the medical review committee, are they the one? Do they get anybody who comes through 1, 2, 3, and 4? They're the first filter for that. Or the prosecutor?
No, they are.
Okay,
yeah,
so,
I mean,
so somebody qualifies, so the weekly list gets updated. Somebody's now either 60, somebody now has been maybe they got bronchitis this week. And they're, you know, all of a sudden you've got somebody they're not 60, but they're sure as heck compromised, both immune and specifically in their lungs, where it's a big deal, I guess. So then, boom, they're on the list. What happens then is the medical review committee will reference the prosecutor's opinion on this person, right?
Correct.
They'll look at you know, all the criteria beyond the health thing that get them qualified for the list, which is then a second layer of qualification, which is like, are they going to have a community sponsor or an appropriate housing or medical situation? Do they have ID to live? Like, you know, does setting them free, does putting them in home incarceration make sense or make problems, basically, is what all those criteria seem to do. And then if they meet those criteria, they shoot it to the Department of Corrections, like the regular parole committee types, and those people have to then review the overall situation and sign off on it or reject it for some reason.
Right. The second prong of this order, which looks to releasing inmates not on parole, but on temporary home confinement, that ultimate decision is going to be made by the Commissioner of the Department of Corrections after receiving assurances from this medical committee. So the DOC makes the initial list. And again, there's a lot of, you know, as with anything in government, there are a lot of players, right? So you've got the Commissioner of the Department of Corrections who's making these lists, right? And then referring the list to the state parole board. You then have these lists also being sent to this medical committee, which is comprised of a designee from the Department of Corrections and a designee from the parole board. That medical committee is then reviewing to determine whether or not there are any individuals who can be released on temporary home confinement. Then that recommendation, after, again, prosecutor input, is being given back to the Commissioner of the Department of Corrections to make a decision as to whether or not those inmates can be released on temporary home confinement. And this executive order is really clear that the DOC, prior to releasing any inmate on temporary home confinement, the DOC has to make sure of a couple things. They have to make sure that they have a temporary photo ID. That's very important. That they are going to be able to get, benefits through a social services agency like Medicaid, Department of Human Services. The order even refers to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, Work First New Jersey program. And, you know, the individuals, the inmates that don't get released, this order says that the DOC has to take all actions to basically minimize and mitigate the inmates' health risks while remaining in DOC custody. So, you know, ultimately, you know, Governor Murphy is allowing the, you know, vulnerable, low-risk inmates to receive temporary home confinement. You know, the goal is to protect their health, but it's also designed to protect the health and the safety of correctional officers and staff. You know, a review of the 9 state prisons where COVID-19 has affected and infiltrated those facilities, it's not just inmates, it's also correctional staff. And so this executive order, you know, looks to protect the low-risk, vulnerable inmates, but also it's looking to protect the health and safety of the correctional workers. The executive order also, and I want to note this executive order would not be applicable to any inmate who's serving serious offenses. So there are certain offenses in the state of New Jersey where an inmate has to do 85% of their sentence prior to being released on parole. This wouldn't release any of those high-risk individuals. It would, again, only look to release low-risk inmates. So if you're serving an 85% sentence, you're not going to be, you're not going to be within 90 days of being paroled, so you wouldn't fall into category number 1, and you also would not be allowed to fall into category 2 for temporary home confinement. So again, this order tries to strike a balance between public health, public safety, and also taking, victims' considerations into account.
I don't see any holes in it. I don't know if they can execute it the way it's on paper, but everything that you've described makes sense. But this is this is the driest video we've done yet. In terms, like, we literally did an outline.
Listen, but it is important. Listen, I think it's important to flesh it out. At the end of the day, and we maybe don't have to go through it page by page, but I think it's important, when the general public hears that the governor, a couple weeks ago, he was releasing people from county jail. A lot of people didn't like that. Now they're hearing that he's releasing individuals from state prisons. And I'm sure the knee-jerk reaction is going to be, how in the world can this be? But when you really flesh it out and go through the order piece by piece, I think it's clear that it puts into account a lot of safeguards, and it includes input from a lot of different agencies to ultimately achieve a goal that the only individuals that are going to be released are those that are either within 90 days of getting paroled anyway, or individuals who are eligible for home confinement, who would not present a danger to the public.
Every time you mention the DOC, I don't know if you were a 90s gangster rap fan, but you realize the DOC was Snoop Dogg's longtime running mate and gangster rap partner. His name was the DOC. So they're going to have the DOC review this. I'm like, he's really come a long way. He's gone from a gangster rapper, now he's giving back to the community. He's going to be reviewing parole applications. And then I was wondering, you said the DOC is making this list weekly. I feel like they should have included language that the DOC should also be checking it twice. I mean, thousands of years of delivering presents on Christmas Eve, I feel like the checking it twice might be more important than the making the list. But that's just a layman's opinion.
Right. Well, it will be interesting to see how many inmates get released and how long it takes for them to be released. I mean, that would be interesting to see. I mean, Hudson County Jail, Bergen County Jail, Morris County Jail. I mean, those jails are really getting hit hard. The state prisons, same thing. More in the north, but you're seeing it, come down the state and enter these southern facilities as well, both county and state. I hate to belabor this difference between prisons and jails. They both have their own separate issues to deal with, but of course, now everybody thinks that they should get out, and that's not necessarily what this order is going to. It's not what the order that he signed into effect related to county jails did, and it's not going to. It's not what's going to happen with regard to state prisons either. But we'll see. We'll see how long it takes. It'll be great for you to be able to find somebody in PA to talk to you about what's going on in jails and prisons in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Most of the serious offenses require somebody to serve 85% of their sentence before they're eligible for parole under the No Early Release Act, NERA. So if you hear anybody ever talking about a NERA offense is an offense that requires 85% of the parole, 85% of the sentence to be served before they can be eligible for parole. Watch the verdict. The verdict, is like in the very first scene, Paul Newman walks into.
Is that Robert Redford?
The verdict. The verdict is Paul Newman. Right?
The one, half dozen of the other, for Christ's sake. Yeah.
I mean, you've got 12 Angry Men.
Haven't seen that in a long time. That was that was always on like Saturday afternoons as a kid.
Right. There's that one. There's My Cousin Vinny's a good one.
Ooh, what about the one? Have you seen the one with John Cusack where he's the juror and he fixes the jury?
No, never.
Gene Hackman's the opposing attorney. The motorcycle riding guy with the handlebar mustache from Animal House is the judge. D-Day. And it's a really good movie.
What's it called?
Shit.
I text it to me and I'll watch it. Not that I have a lot of time in my hands now, so. And then we'll analyze it. Yeah, I really think we should do something kind of fun maybe soon.